I've got to say at the outset, one of the great tragedies of the 500,000 deaths in Syria is that I think it was quite avoidable. If we think back to 7 years ago and how it started, it began with people marching in the streets of Damascus saying, peaceful, peaceful. Their goal was to try to get some element of human rights in a country in which people were being abducted and disappeared in these chambers where they were tortured and killed. We know a lot more now than we did at the time because of a brave military photographer by the name of Caesar. And Caesar brought those pictures out to the West, 55,000 of them. The way in which the regime conducted itself drove the population in Syria to react. And now, after 7 years of war, brutal war, the atrocities continue in Syria. And in many ways, after listening this morning to Caesar and seeing his photographs again, they are worse than they were. I say that because as we speak, despite a ceasefire agreed to by Russia, the Assad regime, backed by Russian warplanes and backed by the Iranian militia from neighboring Iran on the ground, is engaged in a brutal assault in southern Syria. They're engaged there, and more than 45,000 civilians have fled as Russian and regime forces have intensified their shelling and their air raids again on civilian populations. So yesterday alone, 3 hospitals were bombed. The United Nations has said that more Syrians were displaced in the first few months of this year than any period in the last 7 years of war. The first few months of this year. This is happening as we speak. This is one of the children affected by this brutal campaign. The numbers are staggering. As I shared with you, there are over 500,000 Syrians that have been killed. Think for a minute about the families of those who are on the move trying to escape. 14 million Syrians have been displaced. Tens of thousands remain in the regime's dungeons. And that, for me, is the most horrifying aspect of this. It's because the regime will not, despite international pressure, change what it does within those dungeons. The same torture that was exposed to the world in the Caesar photos and the 55,000 photos. And the horrific part of this, I don't know why totalitarian regimes do this, but it's that habit of taking a picture of every tortured, mangled body that you've killed and then numbering it with a number. And number after number after number. It's now a process of civil society in Syria trying to figure out and tie these families together. And the population that was massacred, whether it's Shia or Sunni or Alawite or Christian, it's as though the regime knows no bounds in terms of its suspicions. It's like Joe Stalin's rampage when he decided in the 1930s to begin his process of eliminating anyone who could potentially be an opponent. Take them in and put them to the torture. That is what is happening as we speak. And if the regime retakes southern Syria, thousands more will be detained and meet the same fate as those who are in those torture chambers today. So this morning we had the honor of welcoming Caesar. Adam Kinzinger and I and other members of our committee had the opportunity once more to speak to the Syrian military defector who took those photos with him. Those photos gave us an eyewitness account of the Assad regime's horrific brutality. And today, Caesar provided new, chilling testimony about the Assad regime's attacks against the Syrian people. Industrial-scale torture, as I've told you, is being committed against thousands of detainees. And I will tell you one picture that especially moved me. It showed a young woman. She was an architect in the city. She had had her eyes gouged out. She was tortured to death. And her crime was that she had delivered food and humanitarian aid to individuals targeted by the Assad regime. As you know, the blue helmets in Syria who run into collapsing buildings in order to pull out victims, pull out civilians, and they're non-denominational in terms of, I mean, these are people who volunteer, and they are frequently targeted. It is often those who are doing the rescuing that is targeted by that regime. There can be no real peace in Syria as long as the Assad regime, as long as Assad himself remains in power. We need a strategy that, in the name of humanity, moves beyond Assad to achieve a political solution that will secure a lasting peace among all the parties there. The House has twice passed legislation named after Caesar, sponsored by Ranking Member Eliot Engel and me, to impose sanctions on supporters of Syria's Assad regime, including sanctions on Iran and Russia, because that's where the materiel comes from. That's where the bombs come from. This legislation will help cut off funding that fuels Assad's war machine and give our diplomats much-needed leverage in the political process. Additionally, the Caesar bill will support the prosecution of the regime's war criminals. This includes U.S. assistance for cases being tried around the world, many based on evidence in the Caesar file, such as the one recently filed by prosecutors in Germany. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, the Senate still has not acted on this critical legislation. It is time to sanction Assad. It's time to sanction his backers. It's time to hold war criminals accountable and give justice to victims. And I urge my colleagues in the Senate to quickly move forward. Please move this legislation to help protect Syrian civilians. And again, I want to thank my colleague. I want to thank him for his efforts also, not just his service to this country, including on the battlefield, but his service here today in the interests of humanity. And I yield back my time to him.